The college football season is starting tomorrow, so it's time to get my final predictions out. So, with the final round of Power 4 conferences, this is the Big Ten football predictions for 2024. Let's get into it. So, before I get into team by team predictions and analysis, I'm just going to give a power ranking of the 18 teams so you guys can get a feel for what I think of each of these teams in a vacuum. So, the below average or bad tier is teams I think with an average college football schedule would win less than 6 games, and this is Purdue, Minnesota, Indiana, Northwestern, Michigan State, Illinois. Um, so I think each of these teams would win 6 or less. Illinois obviously was the closest. I almost moved them up into solid bowl team. I think their quarterback's decent. I like their coach, but I just don't think their defense is good enough. Next up, the solid bowl team, just a 3-team tier. And this is Rutgers, UCLA, and Washington. I think all around 6 or 7 win team with an average schedule. Moving on to top 25 caliber, I'm going to have a pretty big tier of Maryland, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Iowa, and USC. I think each of these teams would win at least 7 games with an average schedule, probably around 8. Maryland, you could move them down to solid bowl teams, same with Wisconsin, but Nebraska, Iowa, USC, I think win about 8 games with an average schedule. And then the contender tier, Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, Oregon, I think are all 10-win teams with an average schedule. So that's just the power ranking. But now for team by team predictions, schedule impacts this, where your buys are at, home versus road games, Friday versus Saturday games will all impact the final outcome of how these teams actually perform. All right, so let's get started with these game by game predictions. Coming in in last place, I'm gonna have the Minnesota Golden Gophers. I think if you look at the strengths of this team, they return a decent amount on the O line, got a pretty good running back there, but overall, not many strengths on this team. I think the secondary has some question marks after you lose Tyler Nubin, who was your difference maker in the secondary, and then quarterback, maybe it's a weakness. Right now, I just have it. It's more of a question mark. You bring in Max Brosmer from New Hampshire, I believe, to replace. He's going to be your new starting quarterback, as your quarterback from last year transferred to Rutgers. But that's obviously coming from New Hampshire, the Big Ten is going to be a big step up in competition, and it could be a potential weak point for his team. So let's get into the game by game. I think North Carolina opening up. I think this defense can definitely struggle against a North Carolina passing game that I think will still be pretty strong. And they have one of the best running backs in the country in Omarion Hampton. I think North Carolina puts up too many points for Minnesota to keep up with. But I think Minnesota is able to defeat Rhode Island. I don't know a whole lot about Rhode Island, but Minnesota being in the Big Ten, even if they're not the most talented Big Ten team, should clearly be more talented than Rhode Island and win this game. Then Nevada, I think much of the same I just said. I don't know too much about Nevada, but Minnesota should be able to beat this level of team. Then you get a home game against the Iowa Hawkeyes. I think it's a game Minnesota can definitely compete in. It's your first game of Big Ten play, and Iowa is going to have a really good defense, probably struggles on offense, but I think their defense is enough to slow down Minnesota's offense. And because of how last year's game ended with Minnesota kind of stealing a win there, I think Iowa's motivated and gets this win. I think you lose on the road against Michigan. Michigan too talented, but I think you can compete a little bit if your defense is solid. But I think Michigan's gonna be. I think they'll have a lot of games that look close in the scoreboard or on the scoreboard. But if you watch them, it won't really be close. I think this could be one of those games. USC, I think, has too much firepower. And then a road game against UCLA, I think you lose as well. And it's a tough start for Minnesota for me. I have them starting off 2-5. But then you get a much-needed bye week, in my opinion. And off a bye, I think you get first conference win against Maryland team. That's actually pretty good, in my opinion. But Minnesota will be well-rested and desperate for a win. I think you get it. Don't think you're able to beat Illinois, who I think is a little bit better and has home field. Same scenario with Rutgers. Then you get your final bye, and I think it's a sneaky game where you compete come close to pulling an upset, but Penn State at the end of the day is too talented. And then a road Friday night game to end the season I don't like. I think Wisconsin beats you, and you finish 3-9. All right, so next up, tied with Minnesota in last place, I have Indiana. This is an Indiana team that I think has a pretty good wide receiving core, bringing in Elijah Surratt and returning some of their top receivers there. And I think you have a big upgraded coach, bringing in the coach from James Madison. But weaknesses is the overall talent. You don't recruit very well. You just got a new coach. And I think you have some players leaving. You're bringing in new faces. And overall, it's not as talented as a lot of Big Ten teams. And then the defense last year was not very good. And I don't see much reason for optimism. But I do think you start off with a win against FIU and Western Illinois. Don't know anything about either team, but I think Indiana is good enough to get both of those. But then a pretty tough road trip across country to UCLA. I think it's going to be a loss. I think these are two. I don't think there's a big gap between these teams, but I think the long road trip is enough home field, or is going to throw Indiana off enough for UCLA to get the win. But then you should beat Charlotte before a pretty tough game to predict against Maryland. This is a Maryland team that I think is going to be able to put up points on this Indiana defense, and I think it's going to be too many points for Indiana to keep up with. I'm not sure how much I believe in Rourke as their quarterback, transferring him from Ohio, and I know that I don't believe him enough to put up a ton of points the way I think he will in that in that game. I think you also lose a road game against Northwestern. Pretty even. I just had to go with home field there. Then you get your first bye, and then I think you play a tough game at home against Nebraska. But I'm going to go with Nebraska to win. I think they're a pretty confident team at this point. And even though you have the rest advantage, I think Nebraska is just a better team this year. Before what was probably the toughest game for me to pick on this whole schedule, and that is the Washington Huskies. Washington's coming to Indiana, so it's a pretty tough road trip. Both teams should be pretty well rested. I think Washington's a little bit better. I think it's a really tight game, but I had to give Indiana the loss. I think you also lose on the road in Lansing, and I think Michigan is too good as well. And then you get your final bye, but not in a great spot because it won't help you against Ohio State. But you do get your first win of the Big Ten season in your last game against Purdue, and what's a pretty rough season for Indiana. And I think you go 4-8. Next up in a tie, moving on from those teams, finishing ahead of them is Purdue, who I think has strengths in the secondary talent with Dylan Thyman, and then at quarterback with Hudson Card. But weaknesses, you lose a lot in the transfer portal with Nick Scourton, Deion Burks leaving, and overall a theme for a lot of these Big Ten teams, they don't recruit very well. So when they have major losses, it's a big hit to their overall talent. But still more talented than Indiana State. I think you win that. But then really, really rough. I don't like getting a bye week 2 at all. I think it's really unfortunate for Purdue that the schedule came out like this. And I think Notre Dame's too good. The bye week doesn't help Purdue. I think Purdue's not going to have enough offensive firepower to score on this Notre Dame defense, which could be a top 5 unit in the country. And then after that, you go on the road to Corvallis. Pretty even game. Oregon State loses a lot. It was a coin flip game for me. Could be talked to either side, but I went with Oregon State to get the win. And then I actually have Purdue pulling off a pretty big upset against Nebraska. I think this could just be a game where Raiola for Nebraska has kind of a true freshman game. I think early in the season you'll see like great plays, see some bad plays. I think he maybe just has a game he wishes he had back here early in the season. And I think Purdue gets the win. Don't think they're able to win on the road against Wisconsin or against Illinois. Road games just tough, and I think both teams are a little better than Purdue. But then I think Purdue actually comes close to pulling an upset against Oregon. I think this is a game after Oregon plays Ohio State, so it's a potential letdown spot on a short week on the road on a Friday for Oregon that I think will let Purdue give them a little bit of a scare, but at the end of the day, Oregon is too talented. Off a bye, I think Purdue beats Northwestern, but the next 2 games are clear losses. Road against Ohio State, it's pretty much self-explanatory why that's a loss. And then Penn State, just too talented, too good defensively. and then 2 more road games to end the season. First on a Friday. I don't like road Friday night games. And then against your rival Indiana. I think Indiana is desperate to get a conference win, and they do it here. And I think Purdue finishes 3-9, but with 2 conference wins. They schedule a pretty tough non-con with Notre Dame and Oregon State. All right, so next up we have the Northwestern Wildcats, who last year were able to go 8-5. Were a real surprise team. They ended up making the interim their full-time coach. I'm not very confident in them replicating that this year, but they have pretty good linebacker, pretty good D-line, and they'll have to lean on their defense because I think the QB, I think, could be a big question mark breaking a new quarterback, and the talent's not really there. But I do think he beat Miami of Ohio to start off the year. Don't think he beat Duke, though. I think under Manny Diaz, Duke's going to have pretty good defense still. I think it's a low-scoring game. It was pretty 50-50 for me. Honestly, even while doing this, I'm tempted to switch it to Northwestern just because I really like the home Friday night games. But I think Duke's a little better, but I could really be talked into either way here. But I think you definitely beat Eastern Illinois, and I think you lose a road game. Tough road trip to go to Seattle. And even Washington will still be breaking some new pieces at this point. But I think the road trip's just a little too much. But then you get your bye week. You play Indiana, well rested. I think you should get a win against an Indiana team that's not going to be very good this year. Road game against Maryland. I think it's a loss. Like I said, I don't like the Friday night road games. I think Maryland's a better team as well. Don't think it's a spot Northwestern should win. But then the next week, I think this is a close game that Northwestern comes pretty close to winning. But I think they fall just short against a Wisconsin team that's a little more talented, can put up a few more points. And then at Iowa, I think that defense just too much for Northwestern. Don't see them putting up a whole lot of points. And now the season, you're 3-5, and it's a little demoralizing. I think Purdue gets you as well, 3-6, off a bye. Brutal 2-game stretch against Ohio State and Michigan. We're both just way more talented teams, and I think beat you. But you do end the season on a little bit of a high note, able to beat your in-state rival, Illinois, and finish the season 4-8. All right, so next up, we have Washington, who I think the strengths, maybe the coach, maybe the quarterback. I put question marks because you bring in a new coach in Jedd Fisch, but he was good at Arizona. You bring in a new quarterback in Will Rogers, but he put up a ton of yards and the SEC for Mississippi State. Then if we're looking at weaknesses, you got to talk about roster turnover. You lose Michael Penix. You lose Jalen McMillan. You lose Jalen Polk. You lose Roma Dunze. You lose Braylon Trice. You lose Jabbar Muhammad. You lose your whole line. I mean, it's all gone. This is a completely different team than the one that just played for the national championship, and I think it's going to be pretty clear. But the good news for Washington is getting to these predictions. Pretty easy start. Weber State, Eastern Michigan should both be easy wins. And then the Apple Cup, Washington State's another team very depleted after getting left out of conference realignment and not getting to move to either the Big Ten or the Big 12. And I think Washington beats their rival in the Apple Cup. And then another Northwestern at home. Not a terribly difficult game that I think Washington gets the win in. Is off to a 4-0 start, but you have to, on a short week, on a Friday against a pretty solid Rutgers team. Don't think you win there. And then a rematch against the national champion, the Michigan Wolverines, who I think is going to be too physical for Washington, too good defensively. I think you lose second in a row. And then Iowa, I think, will also be too good defensively, and you lose 3 in a row after starting the season 4-0. Then you get a bye week at, I think, a pretty good time to kind of regroup before a tough road game against Indiana, where I think you bounce back, get a win, and then play a hard-fought game against former Pac-12 opponent USC. I think this game's going to be high-scoring, exciting. I think it's going to be pretty close. Washington will fight, but I think you lose to Southern Cal and lose on the road against Penn State, another really good defensive team, really physical team, similar to Michigan, Iowa, that I think Washington will struggle with this year. But I do think you're able to beat UCLA to get to bowl eligibility at 6-5. You're home on a Friday night. I've mentioned I like this spot a lot. I really like the home Friday night games for the home team. And then I think UCLA is not a great team this year. And I think Washington Will Rogers will be able to have a good game against the UCLA defense. Then you get a bye week, tough bye week. Would have liked it earlier in the year, maybe before the USC or maybe before the Penn State game or something like that. But either way, you get the bye week here. But I think Oregon really wants to beat Washington after losing twice last year. I think they're a far better team. I think it's a pretty bad way to end the season. I think it's going to be a blowout. But Washington will finish 6-6 and make a bowl game. All right, so tied with Washington, we have the UCLA Bruins, who I think the strengths are O-line that mostly returns, and the skill positions should be pretty good as well, I believe, with Sturdivant at receiver headlining that group. But your weaknesses are you lose a lot defensively, including Latu and the Murphy brothers, and then Chip Kelly departed as head coach, but you bring in Eric Bieniemy to help with the passing game. So we'll see how that goes. And getting into predictions, I think you do win a road game in Hawaii. Sneaky game, though. Traveling to Hawaii to open the season could be tough. And then you get a terrible spot for a bye in week 2. But I do think you at least win your first game off the bye against Indiana at home. But then a pretty brutal 3-game stretch with LSU, Oregon, Penn State. I think LSU puts up too many points on this depleted UCLA defense. I think Oregon is just overall too good, too talented. I think Penn State, again, too talented, too good defensively. I think UCLA is now 2-3. Don't think they really compete in any of those last 3 games. I do think they compete and beat Minnesota and then lose a hard-fought game to Rutgers before the bye. Off the bye, you get a pretty tough game with a road game at Nebraska, who I think at this point of the season is playing very well. Don't think you win this. But then you get a home Friday night game against Iowa that I don't think is going to put up a lot of points. UCLA can maybe cause some turnovers. Garbers maybe makes a few plays. I think you get an upset win against Iowa. Then you travel for a road Friday night game where, like Washington, to put up points on this UCLA defense. I think USC does the same, but I think UCLA closes out beating Fresno State in a pretty hard-fought game. And you finish the season 5-7, just missing out on bowl eligibility. Next up, we have the Michigan State Spartans. I think your strengths, you got to look at quarterback upside. Aiden Childs, very talented, but it's going to be his first time starting. So he could be really good. He could be up and down. We'll see, but you at least have upside. Then you got to look at the staff upgrades with Jonathan Smith coming in. You got to think coaching's going to improve. Then the weaknesses, the O-line, a lot of question marks there. And then defensively, this unit was not very good last year, and I'm not sure they brought in the pieces to fix it right away. I do think they are good enough to beat Florida Atlantic to open the season on Friday. Don't think they beat Maryland, though. I think Maryland's a pretty good team this year, a little underrated. You got to travel. So I got Michigan State losing that game. But you should be able to beat Prairie View and get to 2-1. Prairie View obviously shouldn't be able to compete with Michigan State. But then a road game against Boston College. I think Castellanos, the Boston College quarterback, does a little bit too much to this Michigan State defense. And you lose your second game of the season before a brutal 2-game stretch against Ohio State and Oregon, who are both just too good for Michigan State across the board. Better offensively, defensively, more talented. Just every facet of the game is going to be dominated by these two teams. And then you get a bye week. Off your bye week, pretty good time to get a bye week, actually. I think you challenge Iowa. You're able to stay in it because I don't think Iowa's going to put up a whole lot of points, even on a weaker Michigan State defense. But I think Iowa's defense is also going to cause Aiden Childs some problems. Same with Michigan's defense. And I think this is just a really Ohio State, Oregon, Iowa, Michigan, brutal stretch of defenses for a young quarterback. But I think you finally get back in the win column against Indiana when you get to go back home to East Lansing. And then going into your final bye week of the year, you're 3-6. We need a win in all 3 games. I think you lose to Illinois on the road. But I think you win the next 2 at home. So maybe you if you think there's one more win in here, Michigan State can get to bowl eligibility. I think they go 5-7. Tied with Michigan State here, we have Illinois Fighting Illini. I think the strengths are a pretty easy schedule, and then you also got a pretty good O-line there. But weaknesses, I don't think they have great playmakers on the outside and skill positions in general. And then the secondary, like for a defense that was pretty weak last year, secondary still has a lot of questions. So I think against good offenses and especially good passing attacks, the defense will really struggle. One more thing, I think Brett Bielema, pretty good coach, and Luke Altmaier could be a pretty good quarterback for them. You start off with a cupcake in Eastern Illinois. You should get a win, but I think you lose. Even at home, Kansas with Jalen Daniels and Devin Neal, I think make a few too many plays on this Illinois defense, and Illinois can't quite keep up. Do think you beat Central Michigan, but then you lose your conference opener. Tough to open on the road at Friday night in conference against a Nebraska team that I think is going to be much improved, and it'll be too tough spot for Illinois. Then a road game against a really good Penn State team, preseason top 10 team, too much as well. Off a bye, though, pretty good spot for a bye to split up the season. And I think coming back home well rested, you're able to beat a Purdue team. Don't think you can beat Michigan. I think you probably keep it close at home, but Michigan, I think, is going to have a little bit be a little bit too good running the ball against Illinois and just wear out Illinois over the course of the game. Then Oregon, just way too much firepower. They'll beat them passing, they'll beat them running. The defense will make Illinois struggle. I think this is a blowout. But then coming back home, I do think you beat Minnesota team. That could be one of the worst teams in the Big Ten this year. And then off a bye, now you're sitting at 4-5. You need 2 wins in this final 3-game stretch. I think you get one of them against Michigan State. You'll be well rested and at home. But then I don't think you beat Rutgers, and then I think you fail to get bowl eligibility, losing a crucial game to in-state rival Northwestern, and finish the season 5-7. Next up, we got the Wisconsin Badgers. The strengths, I think their secondary graded pretty highly last year and should once again this year. And I put this as a question mark, because if the air raid works, having a much improved offense for Wisconsin could make them maybe like a sneaky dark horse Big Ten title game contender. But it also could backfire and they could be bad offensively and then struggle a lot. Weaknesses, I think the front seven in general is one of the weaker units in the Big Ten. And then skill positions, you're going to need good skill players to run the air raid, you would think. And I'm not sure how good Wisconsin's skill positions are, especially at wide receiver. I do think they beat Western Michigan and South Dakota to start the season, and then a big home game against the Alabama Crimson Tide, but who I think are a really good team this year, and even at home, don't think Wisconsin is good enough to compete with Alabama. Off a bye, I think USC puts up too many points on Wisconsin. If Wisconsin was still like that ground and pound physical team they have been in the past, I think it's a game you beat USC just because of the style of play. But I don't think Wisconsin's really like that team anymore. And then, so I think USC is able to perform well. I think you bounce back with a home win against Purdue and a home win against Rutgers to improve to 4-2. I mean, a road win against Rutgers. Purdue, I think, is just not a great team this year. And I think the Rutgers game will be close and Wisconsin will just squeak by. And then on the road at Northwestern, I think Wisconsin wins another really close game and improves to 5-2. But then a pretty tough stretch happens. Home against Penn State, but Penn State's going to be coming off a bye. The rest advantage, I like Penn State in this spot. I think Iowa's defense is too good. I could see Tyler Van Dyke having a lot of turnovers in these 2 games right here. I think it's a loss for Wisconsin. Off a bye, I think you almost upset Oregon, come really close, but I think you lose it. Just Oregon puts up Dylan Gabriel makes a few too many plays. Oregon's top-level players in general are just able to make just enough plays to squeak out and escape Madison. I think Nebraska beat you as well, who I think will be rolling by the end of the season. And now a 5-2 start has turned into 5-6. But I think you win a crucial game to get to bowl eligibility. against Minnesota and finish the season 6-6. Tied with Wisconsin, we have the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. I think the strengths of this team, you look at the run game with Monagai, and then the defense should be pretty good as well. Weaknesses, not sure how good their skill positions are. And then quarterback, I think is a question. You bring in, your quarterback transfers away. I forget where he transferred to, but you bring in Minnesota's quarterback, Kaliakmanis, to play quarterback. Pretty talented guy, but he struggled a little bit for Minnesota. Little up and down. We'll see how well he performs. But on the bright side, you get an easy 2-game start to ease him in against Howard and Akron. And then you get a bye before a big game against Virginia Tech. But I think Virginia Tech, with Kyron Jones, even against a pretty good Rutgers defense, will make enough plays on the ground to open up a passing game and defeat Rutgers. Rutgers then gets a home game against Washington, which I think is a pretty evenly matched game, but home field on a short week, I think gives Rutgers enough of an edge for me to pick them. But then a tough stretch, road game against Nebraska. I like Nebraska there with Dylan Raiola, an improved team with a good defense. And then Wisconsin, really tough game to pick. I think it's a coin flip game. Could talk me into Rutgers. I ended up going with Wisconsin. And then UCLA at home, I think, is where Rutgers gets back in the win column. Tough road trip for UCLA across the country. And I think I'll give Rutgers. I don't think UCLA will play a very good game here. But now Rutgers travels across the country to play USC on a Friday, and it's the opposite of the UCLA game for me. I don't think Rutgers plays very well. And now you're 4-4. Need to go 2-2 to get to a bowl game this final stretch. Off a bye. Think you beat Minnesota, who I don't think is a very good team this year. And I think Kaliakmanis plays well against his old team. Think you lose against Maryland, who a little bit underrated. MJ Morris at quarterback can make some plays like Maryland. But I think you get to bowl eligibility beating Illinois at home and lose against Michigan State to finish the season 6-6. Maybe not as good as Rutgers fans would like, but I think bowl game for Rutgers, solid season. Now taking a step up, we're going to have the Nebraska Cornhuskers. I think it strengths of this team. The defense was really good last year, returns a lot of the production, and should be a really good defensive team. And then your quarterback upside. So you're starting a true freshman in Dylan Raiola, but he's one of the highest ranked true freshmen in the country, very talented, and he gives you potential. He has the potential to be great even as a true freshman. But weaknesses, I think depth of talent, because they haven't recruited the best, is a question. And then turnovers, because that was a problem last year, and then starting a true freshman at quarterback could still be a problem. Getting into the predictions, you open up with a home win against UTEP before a really fun game against Colorado. Colorado won this game last year at Boulder. I think Nebraska gets back at them with a win and beats Northern Iowa as well to start off 3-0. Then a home game against Illinois on a Friday is a spot I like Nebraska. However, I think you get tripped up against Purdue, a team I think you're better than, but I think it's a game where Dylan Raiola has a freshman game, makes freshman mistakes, and I think Nebraska slips up, but beats Rutgers at home to start off the season 5-1, and then a good spot for the bye before a road game against Indiana. I think Nebraska is well rested, gets the win. I think they get crushed by Ohio State, who's one of the best teams in the country. Now, home game against UCLA. I think you win this. UCLA is going to be a tough road trip. And now you get another bye. Pretty good spot. But you have to travel on the road to USC, who I think will put up points even on this Nebraska defense. Too many points in my opinion. And I do think you beat Wisconsin the next week at home, but lose to Iowa on a Friday. I think I think Raiola struggles against Iowa. I think the defense will be probably the toughest he plays all year, or the Ohio State. I think the Ohio State and Iowa, the two toughest defense he plays will be his worst games. And then the Purdue game too, I think is when he struggles. And then USC, I think, is just going to put up enough points to beat you. And you'll finish the season 8-4. So coming in tied with Nebraska, we have the Maryland Terrapins. I think the strengths of this team are in the skill position. Not as good as they have been in previous year when they had Rakeem Jarrett, Dante Demas Jr., but still very good. And the front seven should be pretty solid. Secondary, however, Maryland's continued, or they lose more players. They continue to have players drafted. I think there's a lot of question marks there. And then the O-line has to perform better this year for Maryland to have a good season. Getting into the predictions here, I think you get a big win against UConn to start the year. And then Michigan State, I don't think is a team that'll be playing their best ball early. I think they bring in a lot of new parts and will improve later in the year, allowing Maryland to beat them. Then I think a sneaky hard game on the road against Virginia, who I think will be very improved this year. And I actually like their team a little bit. But Maryland's more proven and has been a solid team the past couple of years, where Virginia's been bad, and I think will take a step up towards being decent. But Maryland's still ahead of them and gets a win, and then should easily get a win against Villanova at home. But then going on the road against Indiana, I think it's a tough spot, but I think Maryland's able to put up just enough points to beat Indiana, and it's a pretty big win for Maryland, so you can start the season 5-0 before the bye week. Then off a bye week at home, I think Maryland gets another big win and is now sitting at 6-0. A really great start to the season for the Terrapins, but now I think is where the season gets a lot harder, and it kind of starts going downhill. Starting with this USC game, I think they're too good offensively, especially on the perimeter. This Maryland secondary, I don't think can handle it, and this will be a steep upgrade in competition. I think USC will win. Then a road game against Minnesota, I think is close, but I think Minnesota is really desperate, trying to get some wins, and I think Max Brosmer can have a pretty good game and get Minnesota a win. Then off a bye, you play Oregon, toughest team on the schedule all year. I think it's a loss, but Maryland finally gets back in the win column against Rutgers at home, and I think gets a hard-fought win against Iowa. Iowa defense, I was really close picking Iowa because their defense is so good, but I think Maryland just barely gets by before losing at Penn State and surprises people with an 8-4 record and a 6-0 start. Next up, we have the Iowa Hawkeyes, whose strengths are defense and their weaknesses are offense. That's really all there is to it. I mean, the reports are Cade McNamara has not looked good and that they might want to move to the backup. Strange to me because McNamara was obviously solid and took Michigan to the playoffs, so it's a bit confusing. Maybe he's just not the same player after injury. And then Iowa, we know their defense is great. I doubt they'll put up points. So let's get into the predictions. You should beat Illinois State, but I think you actually lose the Cy-Hawk game. Usually Iowa wins this game, so they definitely could again this year at home. But I think Iowa State, if you saw one of my other videos on the channel, it's called a college football theory, and I kind of broke down the trends we've seen with returning production in college football, or how the data looks, and it kind of led me to the conclusion that Iowa State should be a really improved team this year, and I think that'll include a win against Iowa. I then think Iowa beats Troy, and then is really gets up for this Minnesota game after the way last year's game happened, and get a big win. Then off the bye week, Ohio State's just too good. I think it's a blowout, but I do think Iowa is able to bounce back against a Washington team that won't be the best and will have a tough road trip going to Ames, and I think the defense shuts down Will Rogers in that offense. Same against Michigan State. I think a young quarterback in Aiden Childs makes some bad decisions, and Iowa's defense wins it for him. Northwestern, same story. I think Iowa's defense is winning them games here. And much of the same we've seen in the past few years. Iowa's defense bailing out a bad offense. I think it happens with Wisconsin as well. Tyler Van Dyke makes some poor decisions, and now we're looking at a 7-2 Iowa team. But then a road Friday night game after 5 consecutive games, I think Iowa slips up. Offense isn't there. Defense can't bail them out this time. I think you lose. Then off a bye, I think you play a really tough game. Really close with Maryland, and Maryland just barely escapes with a win. But I think you finish the season strong, defeating your rival, the Nebraska Cornhuskers, and finish the season 8-4. All right, so we have the USC Trojans, the inverse of the Iowa Hawkeyes. Their strengths are offense, their weaknesses are defense. Now diving into that a little bit more. Miller Moss should be a good quarterback. Zachariah Branch, one of the most dynamic athletes in the country. Malachi Lemon should be a breakout at receiver. Deuce Robinson should break out at tight end. And then the defense, you would think, should improve a little, bringing in Deanton Lynn from UCLA. but we've thought that in the past with USC. Getting the predictions, I think LSU is actually a win. I think it's a shootout. The over's got to be crazy on this game. Neither team was good at all at defense last year, but both are awesome on offense. And I think it'll be the same this year. I think this is a 50-50 game and first to 40 wins. And I trust Lincoln Riley more in a shootout. I feel like that's just, right up his alley. And then you should beat Utah State before a bye week and play Michigan, who I think is just the wrong type of team for USC. Just that level of physicality is a lot like what caused problems with them against Utah. Michigan is like that to 11. USC will lose this game. But Wisconsin, who's no longer as physical and will have to travel out to the Coliseum, should be a win for USC. Minnesota, not very explosive on offense, shouldn't be able to keep up with USC. So it should be a 4-1 start for the Trojans. But then another really physical game, really good defense, Penn State, the type of team USC doesn't like. I think you lose. But then Maryland, a team that's more equipped for that shootout style, this kind of team USC will be good against. You'll see a theme here. Then home against Rutgers, I think you win, outscore them. Road against Washington, a team that I don't think will have a great defense. Another shootout, and I trust USC in shootouts. Off a bye, well rested, I think you play a really close, really tight game with Nebraska and just come out with a win. Then on the road against UCLA, another team I don't think will have a great defense, won't be the most physical. USC wins. But then home against Notre Dame, great defense, physical team. At this point in the year, I think the offensive line is figured out for Notre Dame in a way it won't be early on, and I think USC loses. So if you see here, I think you play 3 great defenses, 3 really physical teams, and I think USC loses all those games. But when you play high-scoring teams that are still good, like an LSU or a Maryland or a Nebraska, Nebraska's good at defense too, but that style of team, USC will win, and I have them finishing 9-3. Last year, the Ohio State Buckeyes fell short of making the college football playoff after losing to the Michigan Wolverines for the 3rd consecutive season. Will they be able to recapture control of the Big Ten in 2024? Let's look into it. So if you're looking at the strengths of this team, the overall talent of the roster is just going to jump out at you. Just across the board, maybe the most talented roster in the country, right up there with Georgia, Alabama. You could throw in an Oregon or a Texas, but it's mainly Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State have the most talented rosters, and Ohio State probably has the most proven talent on its roster. Defensively, they're stacked with Caleb Downs transferring in at safety. Denzel Burke's going to be there at corner. Both should be future first-round NFL picks. Tui Malau, Jackson Sawyer on the edge, really good. And then you move to the offensive side of the ball. Judkins and Henderson form maybe the best running back duo in the country. Wide receiver, per usual, is loaded. You do lose Marvin Harrison Jr. there, but you return Emeka Egbuka, who could be a first-round pick. Jeremiah Smith's a true freshman, but I think he's the highest-rated true freshman recruit ever, according to 24/7 Sports. And he's, freakish and could definitely have an instant impact, even as a true freshman. And then you have a bunch of other receivers who are former 5-stars, guys like Brandon Inniss or Carnell Tate, who could break out and start performing as top receivers. But getting into the weaknesses, and a weakness for Ohio State's not a very large weakness. For example, the O-line. It's definitely not going to be a bad offensive line, right? But last year it wasn't good enough, and you return most of those players. But so will they be able to take a step forward and become like a top 10 offensive line in the country? I'm not sure. But just because it's weak, it doesn't mean it's a bad offensive line. It'll definitely be above average. But to beat some of the top teams or to win a national championship, it might have to be a great offensive line or a really good offensive line. And I don't know that it will be that. Quarterback is what you got to look at. You bring in Will Howard, transferring him from Kansas State. And what people got to realize is that the fact of the matter is Will Howard transferred from Kansas State because he wasn't going to beat out Avery Johnson for the starting job. Now, maybe Avery Johnson is really, really good, and Will Howard is still good. But the fact is, Ohio State's quarterback would not be starting at Kansas State. And that could be a problem. Because I think although his roster is very talented, at some point in the season, maybe it comes when you play in Michigan, maybe it comes against Oregon, maybe it comes against Penn State, maybe it comes in the Big Ten championship or in the college football playoff. I think a quarterback needs to be able to win you a game, and I don't know that Will Howard is going to be able to do that in the biggest moments. But so getting into the predictions, there are no concerns about Will Howard for these first two games, Akron and Western Michigan. Clear wins for Ohio State. But then you get a really early bye week. I don't like the bye week here at all. I think this is probably one of the worst spots you could get for a bye week. And then Marshall, though, you still crush. And then on the road in Michigan State. Let's just talk about the non-conference is a lot like what Michigan's had the past few years, where they play basically no one. So Ohio State could be rolling, but you just still don't have a true gauge for how good they are because they played such easy teams. But now continuing the predictions, a road game against Michigan State should be a win. I do like Jonathan Smith as a hire there. I think the program's is already heading in the right direction with some of the transfers he brought in, including Aiden Childs from Oregon State coming along with him. But I think currently constructed, Michigan State's not near the level that Ohio State is. Now this Iowa game, I think at home, Iowa can maybe slow down the Ohio State offense. They have a really good defense, but Iowa's offense, even if it became like 10 times better, might not put up double-digit points against this Ohio State defense, which could be the best in the country. I don't think Iowa's going to score. Maybe they won't score, but I don't think they'll hit double digits against Ohio State in this game. Next up, what I would say is probably Ohio State's toughest game of the year, a road game against Oregon. So I think when you're breaking this down, both teams are extremely talented. I think Oregon has a little bit better of an offensive line, but not quite as good of running backs. I think Oregon has the better receiving core, but not by much. Ohio State's is also very good. I think Oregon has a better quarterback. On the defensive side of the ball, Ohio State's going to have the better secondary, probably better linebackers, and then defensive line's pretty close. But Ohio State should have the better defense overall. But so it's so tight that I think home field advantage gives Oregon a slight edge. And then because I think the game's going to be close, it kind of comes down to who do I think is going to make the big plays. And when I look at these teams' quarterbacks, I saw Dillon Gabriel in the Red River Shootout have a game-winning drive, make all the big plays to beat Texas. I don't know that I think Will Howard can do that in this big of a spot, and that's why I'm going to go with the Oregon Ducks to defeat the Ohio State Buckeyes and give the Buckeyes their first loss of the season. Now your second bye is in a much better spot to regroup after a loss and then come back home to play what could be a pretty good Nebraska team this year, but not on the level of Ohio State. I think Raiola will really struggle against the Buckeyes defense, and it'll be, I think, a pretty convincing win for Ohio State before a tough road game against the Nittany Lions of Penn State. That's a game that I think should be pretty tight. I think if you're Penn State, you're expecting Drew Aller is going to take a step forward. You have a really great running back duo of your own, Katron Allen, Nick Singleton. The O-line should be pretty good, although you lose first-round pick at tackle. No, receiver's not as good as you would like it, but it could be improved, and tight end is very good. And then the defense is maybe better than Ohio State's, but definitely in that same realm of great defenses. And you're at home. But I don't think this is the whiteout game. I think it's a 9 a.m. kickoff for me, or 12 a.m. local time. But so it's not going to be that crazy environment at night that the whiteout is, which kind of dampens Penn State's home field advantage maybe significantly. I haven't been to a whiteout, but just like through the TV screen, it feels like that gives such a distinct home field advantage, different than pretty much any other environment. But at the end of the day, when it came to making this prediction, um, I haven't seen James Franklin and Penn State be able to win this type of game. They consistently beat all the teams they're supposed to beat, but when it comes to beating the upper echelon of teams, they don't get it done. And I think that trend continues. Maybe I'll be wrong, but I need to see it from Penn State first before I buy in again. And so I think Ohio State beats Penn State again and then rolls against Purdue, who could be the worst team in the Big Ten this season. Northwestern was pretty good last year. I think they will not be quite as good. And even if they are, not nearly as good as Ohio State. Won't really challenge the Buckeyes at all. Same with Indiana. I think Indiana made a good hire with the James Madison coach and will be better in the future, but definitely not on Ohio State level this year. And now Ohio State's sitting at 10-1 with the only game left being the game. So the storylines will be here. Ryan Day's lost the past 3 years. He's got to get it done. This is the game he has to win. And when I look at this, Ohio State and Michigan, similar level of defense. Both I think will compete to be the best in the country. I think Ohio State's got better running backs. I think I have better receivers. Potentially a better quarterback, although it's a little bit uncertain. O-line, not sure who's going to have the better O-line. But overall, Ohio State's more talented, more experienced. I think a better team this year, and they're at home. But with these past 3 years, there's a lot of times where coming into the game, I could have said Ohio State's more talented, or they're more experienced, or one of the times they were at home, and they've always had the edge on perimeter talent. But so I think there's a lot of times you watch the game and you're like, oh yeah, Ohio State should win this if we look at the edges. But there's something they haven't been able to get over. And similar to how Penn State, it's hard for me to pick Penn State to beat Ohio State, or how it would have been hard to pick Michigan over Ohio State before this 3-year stretch. Yes, at some point Ohio State's going to break the streak, but I'm going to pick Michigan to continue it for a 4th year in a row. And Ohio State, a very disappointing season for them of 10-2, but I think it will still be good enough to get into the playoff, and the season could potentially be saved there. If not, though, Ryan Day could be in serious trouble. In 2023, the Penn State Nittany Lions continue to trend of not being able to beat the top teams in the Big Ten. Will they be able to break that streak in 2024? Let's look into it. So if we're looking at the strengths of this team, I think you got to look at the defense and the running back room. If you're looking at the running backs, you got that 1-2 punch of Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen, which should be one of the best running back duos in the country. Maybe the best in the Big Ten, right up there with Ohio State. And then the defense should be great. It was great last year. Should be great again this year. Abdul Carter, he moves to the edge, where he was more inside linebacker last year, but he's really good in the pass rush, so I think he'll still be great on the edge. And then you got Denny Sutton there, very good player. Kobe King's on that defense. A lot of really good players. The secondary, you lose some pieces, but I think with the transfers you bring in, A.J. Harris from Georgia, and I think there's players on the roster poised to break out, that the defense will be still amongst the best in the country. But if you're looking at the weaknesses, and you got to look at the explosiveness of the offense in the passing game, and so you're looking at the wide receiver talent, and then you're looking at the quarterback. So for the wide receivers, you lose Lambert Smith, transfers to Auburn, but you bring in Julian Fleming from Ohio State. Now, Julian Fleming hasn't proven that he's been to be a true number one. At his time at Ohio State, he was usually more of a third option there behind guys like Marvin Harrison or Emeka Egbuka or the various other wide receivers they've had. But when he was recruited, he was, I believe, ranked the highest wide receiver recruit in the country when he came to Ohio State. So he's clearly a very talented guy. And just because you're not a top option at Ohio State, that doesn't mean you're not a number one player. We've seen this with Jameson Williams when he transferred to Alabama. And you can imagine if you're behind a guy like Marvin Harrison or Emeka Egbuka, or before them, Chris Olave or Garrett Wilson, or all these wide receivers Ohio State produces, that you could still be a really good receiver and one of the best that Penn State's had recently, and not be a top option for Ohio State. But so we'll see what he's able to do. And then a guy like Caden Saunders could be a breakout player, receiver as well. And then the tight end room looks very strong. But Drew Aller, now he's a highly touted guy, highly recruited guy. I think he's about 6'5", big arm, not really mobile, but he should be, that prototypical big pocket passer quarterback. But in the big games last year, that just wasn't there. It was all screen passes or intermediate. There were never any wow throws made by Drew Aller in big games. So even though his touchdown interception ratio was really good last year, when people really watched him play, he didn't look like a very good quarterback. So he needs to be better in the big games this year, and Penn State needs to allow him to be better, which is why they brought in the Kansas, is it Nick Kolimecki? The Kansas OC to help this passing game. So I think it will get better. And I think Penn State will take a step forward offensively this year while maintaining how good they were defensively. I think they're going to have a really good season. How good? Well, let's get into the record predictions. I think you open up with a win against West Virginia. I do think this will be a game where Penn State's offense isn't fully clicking yet, and it'll kind of raise some questions because I think this will be a close, low-scoring, hard-fought win that Penn State's defense makes enough plays to win, and there'll still be questions about Drew Aller and the Penn State offense and how dynamic are the wide receivers. And I don't think this game's gonna resolve those questions, but I think you win against Bowling Green pretty easily. Shouldn't be much of a competitive game for Penn State, and I do think the offense plays much better here. Then you get a really early bye week, which I don't love, but yeah, it doesn't really affect the next game. I think you beat Kent State, the offense still rolling. And then a home game against Illinois, who I think could have one of the weaker defenses in the Big Ten this year. Not a bad team. I think Luke Altmaier could be pretty good for them. But I don't trust the defense because it was not great last year, and you lose your best player in Jason Newton on that D line. And I think Penn State's offense is really clicking at this point. And I really like the schedule the way it works out because Bowling Green, Kent State, Illinois, and then UCLA, which also losing so much on the D line is going to allow Penn State to establish a run game. And then with complementary football, the passing game will be there as well. So I think UCLA is a team Penn State's equipped to beat because they lose guys like the Murphy brothers or Latu to the NFL draft. And I think Penn State's offense looking pretty good. And then another weaker defense in the USC Trojans up next. Now, obviously a better team than UCLA or Illinois and a really dynamic offense that could challenge the Penn State defense. But I think Penn State has too much of an edge on the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. They'll be able to run the ball against UCLA, and I think they'll be able to disrupt UCLA's offense with their pass rush. And I think that'll allow for Penn State to get another win and start the season 6-0, getting your final bye week of the season here. Now, I do like this spot for the bye because if you had gone to USC and then back across country to Wisconsin, I would pick Wisconsin to win this game. But because of the bye week in between and the rest advantage Penn State's going to have, I think you're able to regroup well and beat the Badgers, who I don't think with their new air raid offense will be good enough yet. Maybe it improves more in the future, but at this point, I don't think it's going to be dynamic enough to really cause Penn State's defense serious problems. And I think Penn State gets a win before a huge game against Ohio State. Clearly the biggest game of the season for the Nittany Lions. And it's just one of those games where you would think, with all the things I've said about Penn State taking a step forward offensively, Drew Aller being better, the defense being there, having those running backs, maybe improved perimeter talent, hiring the right OC, it's all set up for Penn State to finally get over the hump. But it's something I need to see to believe, and I'm going to pick Ohio State to win this game. But Penn State will bounce back with a win against Washington. Washington, at this point in the year, I think it'll be clear that this is clearly not last year's team. Significantly worse, actually, and not equipped to be a top 25 team even. Maybe just a middle-of-the-road team. Will Rogers probably be pretty good. And I think Washington got a good replacement for Kalen DeBoer and Jed Fish. but I don't think they're going to be a top team this year, and Penn State will beat them at home. Then you have 2 road games, usually a very tough spot playing back-to-back road games, but Penn State, I think, drew 2 of the weaker teams in the Big Ten, and will be able to win both just because of a vast talent edge in both of these games. Now you finish the year, you're going to be at home against a Maryland team that I think's a little bit underrated. I think they're still a solid team. Not on Penn State's level, though. Penn State too talented, better at defense, control the line of scrimmage here, and should be able to win this game and finish 11-1. Maybe good enough to get to the Big Ten championship. Maybe good enough to get, or definitely should be good enough to get to the college football playoff. The Oregon Ducks fell just short of making the college football playoff in 2023. They now undergo a big transition moving to the Big Ten. How will they perform? Let's find out. So if you're looking at the strengths of this team, I think you got to start with the wide receiver core. You bring back Tej Johnson, maybe the best slot receiver in the country, over an 1,000-yard guy, and he definitely could be a first-team All-American this year. Probably projected to be, actually. He's maybe the best receiver in the country. And then to go with him, you bring in Evan Stewart, a really talented receiver transfer from Texas A&M, formerly #1 wide receiver recruit in the country. He never quite put it all together at Texas A&M, but he was still good. And I think he'll be even better and maximize his talent with the new offensive staff and the weapons that surround him and consistent quarterback play at Oregon. And then you're also deep at this position because you're going to have Gary Bryant Jr., a Trayshawn Holden, a Jurion Dickey, who's 5-star freshman, and then you bring in another 5-star recruit, a wide receiver this year. So you're really deep at receiver. And then at tight end, you also have Patrick Herbert and Ferguson there. So you've got 2 quality tight ends as well. So lots of options on the perimeter. And then the line of scrimmage play, I think with Cornelius and Josh Connerly, you have one of the best tackle duos in the country and therefore one of the best offensive lines in the country. And then the D-line is really good as well with Jordan Birch coming back, Mateo Uiagalelei in his second year off the edge. You bring in another talented edge rusher like Elijah Rushing, 5-star recruit. So defensive line should be really good. If you're looking for weaknesses on the team, there aren't many, but I think you would say defensive experience just because you lose some defensive talent, and then you replaced it in part with some transfers. So like on the interior, you bring in like a Houston transfer. Will he work out right away? And then the secondary is the other spot. I don't think it's a huge concern because you bring in Jabbar Muhammad from Washington, who's a lockdown corner. And then you also have either Jaleel Florence and Dante Manning across from him, who could be good corners as well. Safety, maybe it's a problem. Probably the least certain of the spots on Oregon's roster right now. But I think it'll develop throughout the season, and I think the defense will still be plenty strong enough. And I think Oregon's a very good team. So let's get into the record predictions. Idaho should clearly be a win. Not much to say on that game. And then a home game against Boise State could actually be kind of tricky. I was surprised to see Malachi Nelson didn't win the quarterback job. The Maddox kid won it at Boise State. So that's something of interest. Genty at running back is one of the best in the country. You bring in Chris Marshall, a transfer, really talented, but he's always had off the field issues. If he puts it, if he's able to, keep his head, he could be a really dangerous wide receiver for Boise State. And Boise State could be one of the best group of 5 teams, but Oregon's one of the best teams, period. And at home, they should beat Boise State before the Civil War game on the road against Oregon State. Oregon State loses so much. You lose DJU, Jonathan Smith, Damian Martinez, Jack Velling, Aiden Childs. Pretty much your whole roster has just been depleted with the departure of your coach. And Oregon should clearly beat this version of this Oregon State team. But I am glad that they're keeping the rivalry going. Then off a bye, pretty early bye, because you'll then have to play 8 consecutive games. So not the best bye structure for Oregon this season. But off the bye, you go on the road to face UCLA, a UCLA team that I think is a little underrated this year. I think people think they'll just be bad, and I think they'll be okay. With Garbers back at quarterback, bringing in Eric Bieniemy, but I think they lose too much defensively, especially on the defensive front. Where Oregon with that offensive line and with Jordan James, I think emerging as a star at running back around this point in the season, Oregon will control the line of scrimmage too much and will beat UCLA. And then a home Friday night game. I think for Michigan State. I don't think they'll be able to go on the road on a Friday night to beat an Oregon team that I would say probably should be preseason ranked number 2 in the country. And now the most difficult game, or maybe the most difficult game for Oregon all season, is versus the Ohio State Buckeyes. I think you look at these teams, and they match up pretty evenly. You look at wide receiver, you look at D lines versus O lines, running game, and I think the edge here, for me at least, is going to be quarterback. Since I think this will be a close game, the combination of Oregon being at home and then them having a quarterback that I trust in the big game after seeing what Dillon Gabriel did again in the Red River Shootout last year. He did something I haven't seen Will Howard do, and maybe Will Howard can do that, but for predictions purposes, I'm just going to lean on the home team that I think has the edge at quarterback, and I'm going to give Oregon a 6th straight win to start the season. After the Ohio State game, I think you have actually a game that'll be a lot closer than it should be. I think you're coming off of a really emotional victory that probably takes a lot out of you, and then you're going to have a short week going on the road. It's just a really tough spot. But I do think, fortunately, like if this were, say, the Wisconsin game here, or maybe even the UCLA game, instead of the Purdue game, I would probably be taking UCLA or Wisconsin, just like a trap upset game. But because Purdue, I think, could be one of the worst teams in the Big Ten this year, I think Oregon is able to escape in what's almost a crazy upset. And then after that, you get a home game against Illinois, which I think you win. Illinois, I think, could be a decent team this year. Brett Bielema, pretty good coach. Luke Altmaier could be pretty good at quarterback. But I think the defense is going to struggle, especially against an offense as good as Oregon's. I think Oregon improves to 8-0. And now the other game that might be the toughest of the year for Oregon, and that's on the road in Ann Arbor. I think Michigan is a team that matches up physically with Oregon. Oregon's not going to control the line of scrimmage the way they can against some other teams. I think both teams will try to run the ball, but both teams will be stout defensively. I think Michigan's defense a little bit better than Oregon's. They're at home, and that home field advantage is enough for me to give the win to Michigan. I think what I'm looking at here is Oregon's playing. This is going to be their 6th consecutive game playing. So this early bye week hurts you a little bit, whereas Michigan's going to be more well-rested and at home, and I think they match up well enough to pull off a big win for them, and Oregon drops their first game of the season. And now you come back home to versus the Terrapins of Maryland, and I think you bounce back, and now you're 9-1. Maryland, I think, sneaky good, maybe. MJ Morris, I think, is going to play quarterback for you, and Maryland's consistently been a tier above the bad teams in the Big Ten, but clearly not as good as like a Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan. They've been right in that middle ground, and so I think that continues. Oregon's in that top tier, Maryland's below that, and now you go to Camp Randall to verse the Wisconsin Badgers. Could be a pretty tough spot. I think ultimately I don't really trust Tyler Van Dyke against this level of opponent. He's going to start for Wisconsin this year, and I don't think that offense will put enough points up against this Oregon defense to keep up with the high-powered Oregon offense, and Oregon improves to 10-1, then gets a very late bye week. So I think when I'm looking at this Oregon schedule, I think some point when you play 8 straight games with no bye, I think you're probably going to drop one, and I went with the toughest road game, being Michigan. It's towards the back end of this 8-game stretch, and I think you're going to lose one. Maybe it's Wisconsin. Um, but I went with Michigan. And now off a bye, you'll verse a Washington team. You lost to Washington twice last year. I think Oregon's really going to want this win, be very motivated, well rested, at home against a Washington team not nearly as good as they were last year. I think Oregon blows out Washington and is able to finish the season 11-1 and should be good enough to send them to the Big Ten Championship. The Michigan Wolverines are the reigning national champions. Will they be able to replicate their 2023 success in 2024? Let's look into it. So the strengths of this team, you got to start on defense. This is an elite defense, and in my opinion, the best defense in the country. You've got elite players at all levels of the field. Start up front. The defensive line should be great. Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, it's pretty much consensusly agreed upon, is going to be the best defensive tackle duo in the country. So interior of the defense, great. And I think Josiah Stewart, very good edge rusher there to help the pass rush. Then in the linebacker core, Jayshon Barnum comes in from Maryland. I think he's very good. Ernest Hausman returns, and I think he has a bigger role this year. Also very good. So I think linebacker will be very strong. Then getting into the secondary, Will Johnson, probably the best cornerback in the country, an elite player, first-round pick in the next draft, I would assume. So you've got an elite player there. Maybe there's some questions in the safety and across from Will Johnson, but I think based off camp and how well players are playing there, following Michigan football at all, I think they're going to be pretty I think they'll be okay in the secondary, and I think the defense will be one of the best, if not the best, in the country. And then for the other strength, it's the top-level talent. You have Will Johnson could be a first-team All-American. Colston Loveland at tight end could be. Kenneth Grant or Mason Graham both have that potential. And then a guy like Donovan Edwards with Blake Corum out of the way, getting more carries, he has top or All-American potential. Now, if you're looking at the weaknesses, you got to think that with Jim Harbaugh leaving, all the players you lose, including J.J. McCarthy, Blake Corum, Junior Colson, Cornelius Johnson, Roman Wilson, A.J. Barner, the O-line, you have to think that that could cause, even if at least in the early part of the year, so much change you would think would cause a step back. And then the elephant in the room for Michigan football, quarterback position, who's it going to be? Is it going to be an Alex Orji at quarterback, who, yes, he's a dynamic runner, but he has struggled to pass the ball, it would seem? Is it going to be Jack Tuttle, who seemed to be performing well earlier in camp, but has since gotten injured and probably taken a step back? Or is it going to be Davis Warren, who's maybe the best passer of the group, but maybe not as talented as an Alex Orji overall? So I think quarterback, what are you going to get from that position? Season for Michigan probably is dependent on that. Now, before I get into predictions, just want to make it clear, my dad went to Michigan, so I do root for Michigan a little bit, but I try to keep this as objective as possible and relay what I really think is going to happen this season. So getting started, I think Michigan should beat Fresno State, one of the better group of 5 teams, but at home, Michigan I think still too physical for a group of 5 teams to pull an upset. I don't think this is the kind of game Michigan would lose. And then after the Fresno State game, you have a really big game at home against the Texas Longhorns. And this is a game that reminds me so much of the Alabama-Texas game from a year ago, when Alabama is still breaking a new quarterback who's, yes, talented, dynamic runner, but struggles to throw the ball. Alabama's replacing a lot. They're pretty good at different parts. It's still a very good team, but Texas, with returning talent and Quinn Ewers coming back and a really good offensive line, I think will be able to do what they did. Week 2, you got a big game. All right, so let's get into the predictions. First off, you got a game at home against Fresno State. I think should be a win. Fresno State's one of the better group of 5 teams, but I think with Michigan's physicality and style of play, they're equipped to beat teams they're better than pretty easily for the most part. So I don't think Fresno State will really cause much of a problem. But in week 2, Texas will clearly cause a problem. I think Texas can be just as physical as Michigan. And this game reminds me a lot of the Alabama game last year, where Texas goes on the road in week 2 against a team that's very talented and will improve throughout the year, but is bringing a new quarterback and struggles a little bit early in the season. This reminds me a lot of that, and I think Texas will come into Michigan and win. If I were to make the case for Michigan, it would be that Texas isn't as good at stopping the run this year, and Michigan can maybe exploit that with Donovan Edwards, Kalel Mullings, but I'm not sure how good Michigan's offensive line will be at the beginning of the year. I think it'll definitely be good by the end of the year, and I think it'll still be good at the start of the year, but to fully just run the ball against Texas, I think it would have to be great early, and I don't know that it'll be that. You then beat Arkansas State, not much to say there. And then USC, I think Michigan, one of the worst matchups for USC with their physicality on the D-line and O-line. The exact kind of team USC doesn't want to play or isn't good against. In the Pac-12, they always struggle with Utah because of Utah's physicality. Michigan is just even more physical than Utah and should beat them. In that home game against Minnesota, should also win. Minnesota's a team that I think they bring in New Hampshire quarterback Max Brosmer at quarterback. I don't think they're very good this year. I think Michigan should win this game pretty easily. And then a rematch of the national championship from last season, a road game in Seattle. I don't know if there's ever been a rematch of a national championship the next year where it was so drastically different. Michigan, even with all Michigan lost, Washington lost even more. I don't think they have a single starter back. So you're replacing Michael Penix. You're replacing Roma Dunze, Jalen McMillan, Jalen Polk, Journey Bernard, Braylon Trice on defense, the O-line, Jabbar Muhammad at corner. All your best players gone. You're bringing in so much newness. It's just a completely different team, and a team I don't think will be nearly as good. I think Michigan's more physical, and I don't think Washington. I think Will Rogers will be pretty good at quarterback, but I don't think Washington's going to put up a whole lot of points on this Michigan defense. I think Michigan will win again and get your first bye week of the season at 5-1. A good spot for the bye week because I think if you had gone, I mentioned this, but the back-to-back road games in the Big Ten where you play a Western team and then a team back east, I think is a really tough spot. So if you had to go to Seattle, win, and then come and play Illinois the next week, would have been tough in a trap game that I could have seen Michigan losing. But with the rest and being well prepared for an Illinois team that I think will struggle defensively and won't be able to put up points on this Michigan defense, like a lot of teams in the Big Ten, Michigan will win. Next up, you got your rival Michigan State, who I think at this point of the year, clearly showing improvement. Aiden Childs probably playing pretty well, but I think this game will show he's still got a lot to learn. I think the offense of Michigan State will struggle. I don't think it would necessarily be like a huge blowout, but I think Michigan limits them enough offensively to win this game convincingly before a huge game at home against Oregon, an Oregon team that I think is more talented than Michigan, better on the perimeter, maybe better at running back, probably close, should be better at O-line, not as good defensively. But I think this is going to be a really tight game. And what it came down to was I think Oregon's a little bit better, but Michigan is going to be more well-rested. Oregon's playing like 6 consecutive games at this point in the season. Michigan only going to have 2, neither of which were the most challenging. And I think Michigan's playing their best ball of the season right now. Quarterback is at least, I think, giving you solid production. So you're more well-rested, you're at home, and you're playing your best ball of the season. I think it's enough to defeat the Oregon Ducks at home. And now you're feeling good. You go to Indiana, and I think it's a bit of a letdown spot, and it'll be really close. I think Michigan's just able to escape with a win. I think this will be one of Indiana. I think this will be a game Indiana is like really gets up for. A spot Michigan's coming off an emotional win, classic letdown, and I think Michigan maybe gets away with like a game-winning field goal, or it goes to overtime, something like that, where it's just a top team barely escaping. Then you get your final bye week of the season before this final very important 2-game stretch. First, you beat Northwestern at home, a team that was a surprise team last year. Don't think they're as good this year, and Michigan should win before they play the game against the Ohio State Buckeyes. Ohio State, on paper, should win this game. They're better. They're at least even defensively, you would think, and they're better in pretty much every area offensively. And they're at home. But Michigan should be well rested. And this is kind of one of those games where, because what Michigan's proven to me over the last 3 years, where even when it seemed like Ohio State should be able to beat Michigan, Michigan was still the team that found a way to win, consistently more physical, found ways to come out on top. So, like I said, I'm trying to be objective. Maybe my bias seeping in here, but I think with just what I've seen the past few years, I gotta give it to Michigan. They've proven they're able to get wins in this game recently, and I'm gonna pick the Michigan Wolverines to stay atop the Big Ten and go 11-1, head to the Big Ten championship after going undefeated in Big Ten play. So here are the final standings for the Big Ten. So key takeaways here is hot take that Ohio State's going to come in fourth. And then the other thing is I don't know exactly how this tiebreaker would work out for Oregon and Penn State because they don't play each other. But because Oregon lost to Michigan and Penn State lost to Ohio State, I think that would result in Oregon getting the tiebreaker and playing for the Big Ten championship, which I have here. It'll be Oregon versus Michigan. Dylan Gabriel, the Oregon Ducks, and their high-flying offense getting a chance to avenge their only loss of the season against Michigan. And I do think they're able to do it. I think Michigan was able to win in the regular season because they had more rest, because they were at home. But in a neutral site where Oregon will actually be a little bit more rested with the late bye, and I think they are the more talented team. Unlike last year where I think Oregon's unable to get revenge in their conference title game, I think they're able to do it this year and clinch the bye for the college football playoff and potentially be a top seed in the college football playoff. Thank you guys for watching this video. My college football playoff predictions are coming out later. Make sure to check those out to see how Oregon does and the rest of the teams in the field. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.